Bradley Manning obviously plays an important role in terms of trying to expose the massive secretization, privatization, corporatization, and just badization of American foreign policy. In many ways, he's among the most important figures of the last 10 years in terms of actually trying to do something useful to change a foreign policy that I think many of us in this room and in Brooklyn for Peace have been spending much of our time trying to change. Chase has written, I think, the first draft of history. Is that what we call this type of thing?
Oh, yes, always.
And I will say, before I let him read, I want to commend everybody's attention to a piece that he wrote earlier this week about the rules of war and what it actually does in terms of legalizing the murdering of civilians. I think that part of what Chase brings to the whole topic of Bradley Manning is a lawyer's keen insight. But this is a lawyer who actually believes that there is something to the law and that the law is something worth fighting for. With that, I'll give you Chase.
My name is Chase Madar. I'm an attorney. Most of my legal practice has been right here in Brooklyn with the community group Make the Road New York, based in Bushwick, where I worked for nearly 5 years. More recently, I've been writing about foreign affairs and politics for Le Monde Diplomatique, the London Review of Books, The National Interest, the American Conservative magazine, which I can explain, and Tom Dispatch. I'm going to read just a few short passages from my book and then open it up to Q&A, which I'm sure will be more fun, more stimulating. I'm going to start by reading a couple of the reasons why I think Private Bradley Manning deserves the Presidential Medal of Freedom or the Nobel Peace Prize. And then I'm going to read a short passage from the end of the book that goes back to the theme that David just mentioned about what the laws of armed conflict really do. Do they civilize warfare, or do they just legalize and authorize atrocity? So, a medal for Bradley Manning. Bradley Manning deserves the Presidential Medal of Freedom. If the 24-year-old Army private from Crescent, Oklahoma did supply Wikileaks with its choicest material, the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, and the State Department cables, then he surely deserves some important national honor instead of the military prison cell where he presently awaits court-martial. Charged under the Espionage Act of 1917 and with aiding the enemy, Manning faces life in prison. He has put his sanity and his freedom on the line so that Americans and the rest of the world might know what their government has done and is doing all over the world. Knowing what our government is doing is not a special privilege for statesmen, spies, and insider journalists. It is the right and responsibility of all citizens. Manning has blown the whistle on criminal violations of American military and international law. He has exposed our government's pathological overclassification of important public documents as well. There are at least 5 reasons why Manning, if he did what the government accuses him of doing, deserves that medal. I'm only going to read the first 2. First, for giving our foreign policy elites the public supervision they so badly need. In the past 10 years, American statecraft has moved from one catastrophe to another, laying waste to other nations while never failing to damage its own national interests. A Brown University study finds that the past decade's war have resulted in at least 140,000 civilians, 6,000 American soldiers, and 2,300 civilian contractors killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, with 4,000 young U.S. veterans dying after returning home. This has cost the U.S. Treasury $3.7 trillion and done untold damage to the infrastructure of Iraq and its people. Few outside of Washington would argue that any of this has made America safer, much less brought human rights to Iraq. Although downsizing our entire foreign policy establishment is not an option, the website Wikileaks has at least brought public scrutiny to bear on our self-destructive statesmen and women. No one should be more grateful for these revelations than Americans, whose government has deceived us with such horrible consequences. Consider our invasion of Iraq, a war based on willful distortions, government secrecy, and the complacent failure of our major media to ask the important questions. But what if someone like Bradley Manning had provided the press with the necessary government documents, which would have made so much self-evident in the months before the war began? Thanks to Manning's alleged disclosures, we have a sense of what transpired in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have an image of how Washington operates in the world. Thanks to those revelations, we now know just how our government leaned on the Vatican to quell opposition to the Iraq War, for instance. We know now how Washington pressured the German government to block the prosecution of CIA agents who kidnapped an innocent man, Khaled el-Masri, while he was on vacation. We know how our State Department lobbied hard to prevent a minimum wage increase in Haiti, the hemisphere's poorest nation. It is all to our benefit that more whistleblowers make themselves heard. A foreign policy based on secrets and spin has manifestly failed us. In a democracy, statecraft cannot function if it is shrouded in secrecy. For bringing us the truth, for breaking the seal on that self-protective policy of secrecy, Bradley Manning deserves the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Second reason, for exposing the pathological overclassification of America's public documents. Secrecy is for losers, as the late Senator and United Nations Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say. If this is indeed the case, it would be hard to find a bigger loser than the U.S. government. When Moynihan, a conservative Democrat who served as Nixon's UN envoy, wrote those words in 1991, the U.S. was classifying upwards of 6 million documents a year. Today, that figure has risen by an order of magnitude, with Washington classifying some 77 million documents in 2010. Government secrecy, especially in the domain of foreign affairs, has become pathological. In June 2011, the National Security Agency declassified documents from 1809, while the Department of Defense only last month, meaning I think July of last year, declassified the Pentagon Papers, publicly available in book form these last 4 decades. Our government is only now finishing its declassification of documents relating to World War I. I want to ad-lib here that what Bradley Manning is alleged to have leaked, that quantity of documents is not even 1% of what Washington classifies in any given year. And that gives the lie to the claim that you frequently read that Bradley Manning and Wikileaks are some utopian group bent on total transparency. What they are fighting for is just a minimum of transparency. No one wants nuclear launch codes going about, but if we can't even get 1% of this declassified in a year, we are in real trouble. Now, this would be ridiculous if it weren't tragic. Ask the historians. Barton J. Bernstein, Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford University and a founder of its International Relations Program, describes the government's classification of foreign policy documents as, quote, bizarre, arbitrary, and nonsensical. George Herring, Professor Emeritus at the University of Kentucky and author of the Encyclopedic From Colony to Superpower, has chronicled how his delight at being appointed to a CIA advisory panel on declassification turned to disgust once he realized that he was being used as window dressing by an agency with no intention of opening its records, no matter how important or how old, to public scrutiny. The people of a democratic state ignore such signs at their risk. If a society like ours doesn't know its own history, it becomes the great power equivalent of a wandering amnesiac, not knowing what it did yesterday or where it will end up tomorrow. Right now, classification is the disease of Washington. Secrecy, its mania, and dementia, its endpoint. This is not just the diagnosis made by groups like the ACLU and Wikileaks. J. William Leonard, career federal civil servant and director of the Information Security Oversight Office from 2002 to 2007, has recently called for sanctions against government officials who gratuitously classify government documents. Now, President Obama came into office promising a sunshine policy for his administration while singing the praises of whistleblowers. Instead, he has launched the fiercest campaign against whistleblowers the Republic has ever seen and dragged our foreign policy deeper into the shadows. Challenging the classification of each tightly guarded document is impossible. No organization has the resources to fight this fight, nor would they be likely to win right now. Absent a radical change in our government's diplomatic and military bureaucracies, massive overclassification will only continue. If we hope to know what our government is so busily doing all over the world, Massive leaks from insider whistleblowers are, like it or not, the only recourse. Our whistleblower protection laws urgently need to catch up to this state of affairs. And though we are hardly there yet, Bradley Manning helped take us part of the way. He did what Barack Obama swore he would do on coming into office. And for striking a blow against our government's fanatical and very counterproductive habit of secrecy, Bradley Manning deserves not punishment, but the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, I'm going to cut ahead to the end of the book and talk about the laws of war, what they do, what they don't do, what we wish they wouldn't do, what we wish they would do, and the collateral murder video. How many of you have seen the collateral murder video? That's the most sensational Wikileaks disclosure. That's the helicopter video shot from the gun sight of an Apache gunship 1.5 miles over a suburb of Baghdad in July 2007. You see it opening fire. Okay, many of you have seen it. Now, you look at this video and you think, well, okay, that's obviously a war crime. You see a helicopter just gunning down a crowd that is mostly civilians. There are a couple of armed guys in it. There were a couple of Reuters news agency employees there, too, who are getting gunned down and were killed. And you think, well, this has to be a war crime. But it's far from clear whether that's the case. And that's not a defense of what the helicopter gunship did, but it's really an indictment of the laws of war and how little they actually accomplish for civilians. We lawyers tend to think that law is by nature something good and just, and that it's dirty politics that fouls everything up. But the WikiLeaks disclosures reveal something far more troubling than violation of the rule of law. They reveal the pathology of the laws themselves. Can it be possible that the rule of law is not an unmitigated good? In fact, several of the most appalling atrocities revealed in the leak are in fact perfectly legal, showing us that the rules and laws of the game are often profoundly problematic, if not downright rotten. Let's start with the collateral murder video watched by millions around the world, an unclassified item allegedly leaked by Bradley Manning. To recap, the video shows an Apache gunship opening fire on a group of civilians, including 2 Reuters news agency employees, accompanied by a couple of men with weapons. The gunship circled back to shoot the wounded dead, and when a van comes in to retrieve the wounded, the gunship shoots it to pieces too. All the while, pilot and crew joke amongst themselves, a violation of etiquette that has weirdly drawn the most condemnation. One might expect that such a graphic atrocity would be fodder for the condemnation of the major human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, who monitor violation of the laws of war. But not one of these groups has issued a statement on the massacre. Human Rights Watch declined to comment entirely on the incident in their report on human rights law and international humanitarian law violations in Iraq, published in February 2011. There is no mention of the incident at all, though it lies well within the time frame covered by the document. Tom Parker, Policy Director for Terrorism, Counterterrorism, and Human Rights at Amnesty International USA, told me that they had not commented on the incident largely because any report was bound to be muddy and far from clear-cut, given that the law is not all on one side. Gabor Rona, legal director of Human Rights First, told me that there wasn't enough information to ascertain whether international humanitarian law, as the laws of armed conflict are euphemistically called, was violated. He told me that Human Rights First had no freedom of information requests pending for much information. Why haven't any of the big human rights outfits commented on this sensational and widely known atrocity? Rona told me he didn't know, and he seemed a little embarrassed, to his credit. Why haven't these human rights groups addressed the most vividly documented incident of the military slaughter of civilians since the My Lai massacre? These human rights experts were certainly as troubled as anyone else by the killing. The media departments of all 3 nonprofits are always hungry for headlines. It's not as if they, unlike the rest of the world, did not watch the video upon its release in March 2010. The reason for their silence is disquietingly simple. The gunship's actions were, under the rule of law as codified and accepted in international humanitarian law, perfectly legal. Recognition of the massacre's legality can be seen as a defense of the helicopter crew's actions, or as an indictment of the laws of war themselves. As Gary Solis, an expert in the laws of war at Georgetown University, painstakingly pointed out in an interview with Harper's, the gunship crew's decision is by the letter of the law defensible. Among the civilians, there were plainly a few armed men. Nobody contests that. There had been insurgent gunfire in the area earlier in the day. We should remember that the laws of war unambiguously permit the killing of civilians, provided that the killing of civilians is proportional to the military advantage pursued, that a reasonable effort is made to distinguish combatant from non-combatant, and that the overall objective is a military necessity. These principles turn out to be remarkably supple when managed by a great power occupying a lesser power. As for opening fire on the van, this too was legal. An enemy vehicle without Red Cross, Red Crescent, or white flag receives no special protection, even if wounded personnel are on board. The conclusion, however discomforting to the moral intuition of most humans who have seen the video, is unavoidable. I believe it unlikely that a neutral and detached investigator would conclude that the helicopter personnel violated the laws of armed conflict. Legal guilt does not always accompany innocent death. It bears noting that Gary Solis is no neoconservative ultra, but a seasoned scholar who has taught at the London School of Economics and West Point, and is an unhesitant critic of many of the Bush-Cheney administration's legal distortions. Many viewers of the video found it disturbing to consider that the gunship's crew shot dead some dozen civilians and suffered no penalty. This implies an abuse of the system. What many find more disturbing still is that these soldiers' actions are safely within the zone of legality, and under the laws of war as we know them, are deserving of no penalty whatsoever. This implies an injustice hardwired within the system of laws itself. And I hope you all understand the point I'm making. I'm not defending the massacre or saying that because it's permitted by the law, it's somehow okay or no big deal. The point I'm trying to make is that war is not amenable to regulation and to legal rules. We like to think that the problem is maybe not war, it's just war crimes we don't like. But if you look at that video, those people getting killed were not killed by war crimes. They were not killed by violations of international humanitarian law. They were killed by war, plain and simple. And that's why groups like Brooklyn for Peace are so profoundly important. Human rights groups, for all the great work that they do, are not wired or capable of taking a stand against war. That's a political position that's outside their compass. And that's not a criticism. I mean, all groups have their limits and their missions. But Brooklyn for Peace and other groups that are explicitly anti-war will go out and we will oppose whether the war in Iraq or the war in Iran that is whose drums are beating right now. So thank you all for coming today. The laws of armed conflict, it's a combination of standard usages, conventions, that's international law, and many of these conventions, both of them are written into the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Well, we do have a couple whistleblower protection laws on the books, but
In what context? That's the question.
Well,
Generally speaking, or yeah.
We do have a national law, and it is interpreted very narrowly and always to the benefit of the government prosecuting the whistleblower rather than to the benefit of the whistleblower. I don't think Obama is fully in control of the national security state apparatus. And this isn't to let him off the hook or to absolve him, but our national security state apparatus it's on steroids, it's spoiled, it's like a 300-pound Rottweiler. And in order to get it under control, it would require a president who has the political will, the political skills of manipulating, and also preferably some experience in the military. And Obama has none of these. And I say that again not to let the president off the hook, but just to point out that it's a bigger problem than whichever individual happens to be in the president. It's not a matter of just flicking a switch on and off. Yes, Tom?
I remember when the New York Times first reported on the series of things that were exposed in Wikileaks. They had like a double-page spread, and they talked about a lot of illegal dealings where people in the State Department, people in the U.S. Army, people in the U.S. Marine Corps did things that were clearly illegal. Has anybody has there been any charges, any punishment for anybody except for Bradley Manning? I mean,
Nothing that's been public. Now, there may be confidential internal reviews that are, of course, secret, like so much else, but nothing that's been public.
But, all right, and just one more. I mean, I heard that like in other countries, like in Italy, for example, where there was clearly Italian and American politicians doing things that broke U.S. and Italian and international laws. Any signs of civilized law enforcement anywhere? Or?
No, I mean in Italy too, and there's just intense political pressure that the United States is able to bring to bear there to prevent the prosecution of CIA officers there who were involved in kidnapping there. They were able to squash that and prevent it. Behind you, Tom, sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about what the defense is for Bradley Manning and how there can get to be more publicity so that more average Americans can hear about what's going on and some of the points that you've been making?
So first, the defense. Bradley Manning's defense lawyer, who's an experienced military lawyer, it is a military court-martial in a military court. His defense has a few prongs. He's not arguing that his client Bradley Manning did not do the leaks. He's rather arguing extenuating circumstances in a hope to mitigate the sentence and get a softer penalty. First, he's arguing that the leaks did no damage to American national security or real damage to U.S. national interests. And that's a surprisingly, or maybe not surprising, that's an easy argument to make because there is no evidence. For all the hot air that's been breathed about what a threat to civilians this is, how this puts our Afghan collaborators at risk, there's not a single credible account of any casualties tied to Wikileaks. And though our media is generally silent about the real casualties from our wars, they suddenly become very moral when they start speculating about the imaginary casualties attributed to WikiLeaks. Another thing that the defense counsel is arguing is that Bradley Manning did not get the adequate mental health attention that he needed while in the military, and that they failed there. Now, the fact that Bradley Manning may have needed some mental health attention makes him utterly ordinary as a U.S. soldier. As you may know, the #1 killer of active duty servicemen and servicewomen today is not combat, it's not IEDs, it's suicide. And the suicide rate for recently returned veterans is astronomical. So there are all kinds of mental health needs throughout the armed forces that are not being addressed. Suicide's been the top killer for the past 3 years. The last thing that Bradley Manning's lawyer is arguing is that there was no real security at the base where Bradley Manning was deployed in Iraq, and for where he allegedly exfiltrated all these classified documents. And that seems very true too. There was no security. It was easy to get in and out with the discs. He famously labeled it as a Lady Gaga disc. And that's the defense argument. Now, some people have faulted the defense attorney for not making an aggressive political defense and putting the prosecution on trial. I am not quick to fault him there. I'm not sure that's the best course here. 40 years ago, that may have been a good strategy when the political climate in the country in general was more favorable to that. But we are in a different political climate. We are not at the high water mark of liberalism, and even in spite of our failed wars, the kind of generalized fatigue with war that we had in the early 70s with Vietnam, I don't think we're that way yet, unfortunately, because we should be. And how to spread publicity? I don't know. So, yeah, is there a will to knowledge, or is there a stronger will to ignorance? And I have a chapter about this in the book. Intellectually minded people, we like to think that everyone wants more knowledge because, if you work in the media or something, then you're bringing the knowledge that gives you a central role in the story. I think knowledge and even sensational leaks turn out to be depressingly I don't want to say impotent, but not as powerful and as catalytic to political change as we might like to think. I don't say this to somehow condemn Bradley Manning or say, oh, he's a failure as a whistleblower. I think he's a great whistleblower. The failure is in our society to do something useful with the information and to have the honesty and the courage to look at what our government has been doing, both abroad and at home. It takes some leadership and political pressure to bring the country or more people in the country to that point. I mean, that's why we're all here today. I see a lot of non-impact more than anything. I see an absence of impact and an absence of change resulting from these on the whole. But there are interesting exceptions to that. I talked to Haitian American activists who are thrilled to have the Haiti leaks and to get the real scoop on what U.S. policy towards their homeland has been. And that's been a big deal in the Haitian diaspora. And it hasn't borne instant fruit from that, but having that knowledge is very important.
If Brooklyn for Peace were wanting to lobby the Nobel Committee, they go online, they'd have, how would they contact the Nobel Committee?
That's a great question. I think that's a great idea
Yeah.
to help lobby. And there is an international effort to nominate Bradley Manning.
Right.
And I think we here in the United States have to hold up our end. I mean, we should be at the front of that pack. And I don't know the exact way to do this online, but it's something worth looking into. Absolutely.
Great idea.
Yeah,